must say that after that conversation, I couldn't have disagreed more with what John Lindsay said when he said our best young men went to Canada. He was dead wrong. I know where our best young men went. They went to Vietnam. They served with honor, and the country is eventually going to honor them, I trust, in the way that they deserve.
Okay, hold positions, everybody. I need to make a quick tape stop here, and then we'll continue. So don't leave your positions. Tape, roll off, tails out.
Well, now you've got what? Down to the... We've took a little more time than you expected, huh?
Well, I decided just to take the first hour.
Further, but I'll tell you that was
I need a few minutes to.
Excuse me, sir. Your lip is fine. It's not perspiring. If that's
No.
okay.
Oh, I
fine.
see.
Oh, right.
Every
Oh.
once in a while, you're
I think I'll go out and get a cup of coffee if I
Okay,
can.
can we unwire the president here?
Yes, sir. We're right here.
Yeah.
1 second.
We're going on now to the
I'm gonna
tape playback.
do the same.
Okay.
$11:35, $12:35.
Stand by. One.
In this conversation with former President Nixon, we'll cover his vice presidential years from 1953 to 1961. Why were you chosen as Eisenhower's vice president? What did you bring to the ticket?
Well, he told me years later that what he thought I brought to the ticket was first a bridge to younger people, and he was making a great effort to win younger people. Second, a possible way to build a bridge between him and the regular Republicans, because he knew that I had considerable support among those regular Republicans. And third, and I think this may have been the decisive factor, because at that time domestic communism was a major issue. He felt that I had credentials in this area, as he put it to me, you got his and you got him fairly. And he felt that I, therefore, would be a good answer to the extremists like Joe McCarthy, who didn't care that much about fairness in his opinion. I think these factors were those that made him make that decision. And finally, I think another factor was that he had been told, particularly by Tom Dewey, that I was a pretty good speaker.
How did you and Mrs. Nixon feel about the prospect of becoming national figures, leaving the Senate and becoming a vice president if the ticket won?
Well, her attitude was quite negative, actually. Not negative in the sense of not being willing to go out and do the campaigning, which she had done so well for the House and Senate, but negative in terms of the fact that we had just been through the Senate campaign. We were looking forward to 6 years in Washington with our young daughters, a little more peace, not out there fighting battles and so forth. And she knew very well that the 52 campaign would be tough, and that from then on we'd be living in a fishbowl. And she didn't care that much for all that public notoriety.
How did you feel? Were you excited by the prospect?
Mixed emotions. I would have to say yes, because after all I was only 39 years old, and to even be considered for vice president, particularly running with General Eisenhower, for whom I had enormous respect, was to me something that you only dreamed about. But on the other hand, I was aware of the fact that I was building a career in the Senate, that I had plenty of time, and I wasn't so sure that I wanted to make this move at this relatively early age into a position that, and I had studied a lot of history, that Harry Truman had said is about as useful as a fifth hit in a cow, and Theodore Roosevelt said it's like taking the veil. On the other hand, to answer it, with all these things measured, did I want to do it? The answer is yes.
You got the word that you had been chosen, and when you got the word that you had been chosen, you went to Eisenhower's hotel room to meet him. What was that meeting like?
Well, for me, quite an emotional meeting, because I had met him before at the Bohemian Grove in California after I had been nominated for the Senate in 1950. And then in Paris, when I had called on him and had an hour with him when he was serving at SHAPE as Supreme Commander.
Didn't you write that at that meeting you were impressed because he was wearing an Eisenhower jacket?
He was not only wearing an Eisenhower jacket, but he was so erect and vigorous and young. What impressed me, too, was another factor that Winston Churchill says is one of the most important attributes that a political figure can have. He said, when you meet another person, he said, if you really want to impress him, try to make him feel after you have met him that he has done well rather than that you have done well. And I was really quite impressed by the way that Eisenhower, when I met him, rather than talking about himself, he did answer my questions with regard to SHAPE and the rest. He was very interested in what I had done, asked me about the His case, said he had read Ralph de Toledano and Victor Lasky's book, Seeds of Treason, congratulated me on being very fair. I thought right then, he's a pretty coony fella.
So you go into the suite at the Blackstone Hotel.
Yes.
He shakes your hand and asks you to join his ticket.
Yes, I must say that I had a little bit of an uneasy moment because when I walked in, I didn't know really what to call him. He'd just been nominated for president, and when I had met him previously at the convention, he had attended the California delegation, and of course I called him General. So I shook his hand and I said, hi, Chief, and I could tell he didn't like it. Now, the reason I used the term chief was not in a derogatory sense, but that is what Herbert Hoover had always been called, and I thought it was a compliment. But President Eisenhower, incidentally, didn't like that kind of a familiar term. I should point out that in the entire period of his presidency, I never called him Ike. I always called him Mr. President. And also, after he left the office, I didn't call him Mr. President. he wanted to be called General. But I was one of the few of his intimates, as I did become an intimate later on, who never called him Ike.
Did he consider general a higher calling than president?
I think he did. I think he did. But in any event, we sat down, and he was quite formal. And he said, asked me if I would be willing to join this crusade. Well, I said, of course, I would be honored to do so. And then I remember a rather poignant incident that occurred. As we were talking, all of a sudden he snapped his fingers and he says, "Oh, I've forgotten something. I've got to resign from the Army." He called in his secretary, dictated a letter resigning from the Army. And I thought, here is 50 years changing from one career to another. And I also thought in the back of my mind, I hope he isn't going to be too disillusioned when he gets into the ring in politics, because I knew with Harry Truman on the other side, with Adlai Stevenson, with his rather cutting rhetoric, that it would not be an easy campaign, even for Eisenhower.
From that meeting, you went to the convention hall where you met Mrs. Nixon. We have some film of your arrival at the convention hall and then your nomination as vice president in 1952. That's your one suit, huh?
I feel overwhelmed. It was a tremendous surprise. And declares Richard M. Nixon, the Republican nominee for Vice President by acclamation.
I remember incidentally when that demonstration was going on, and it went on and on and on, that I kept telling Joe Martin, I says, "Can't you calm him down?" He turned to me with that sort of Irish twang of his, and he says, an old saying, he says, "Get in the hay while the sun is shining." And you see there, Pat, Mrs. Nixon, kissing me. What had happened was that I was at the Stockyards Inn when I got the word, and she was having lunch with a friend of hers. She got the word when she got it, and I dropped the sandwich on the floor. She was so surprised, and here we are together.
It must have been...
She hasn't changed, but I don't think I was ever that young.
Will you ever be that young again?
Possibly.
That must have been a heady moment for you, for both of you, to be standing in front of a national convention, and for the first time, of course, you'd been in the House and you'd been in the Senate, so you'd campaigned, but to hear all those people cheering for you to become to become the vice president.
Well, the first time, of course, is the one that is always the mountaintop experience. Not that everything else is downhill, but there's nothing that equals it. For example, people ask, which election gave me the biggest thrill? It wasn't being elected president, it was being elected to the Congress. That was really a big thrill.
You remember.
And the same thing is true here. I addressed this convention, and then I addressed the 1956 convention, the 1960 convention, 1964, when I introduced Goldwater, 1968, 72. All were memorable. The excitement of the crowd and so forth, it really gives you a lift. It turns on the adrenaline if it wasn't already there. But nothing like the first time, nothing like the first time.
We have a photograph of the two nominees at that night receiving the acclaim of the convention. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember
moment?
it very well. That's a very famous picture, too. It was used all over the country on posters and that sort of thing.
You look very happy.
Well, I was happy, and I must say, though, that I sensed when I held the general's arm up that he resisted it just a little. He didn't indicate displeasure, but that he didn't quite like it. And later on, I learned that in watching him over the years, that Eisenhower didn't like people to manhandle him, to grab him, and so forth. He had a great sense of dignity and also of privacy. He wasn't the average politician in that respect. I remember, too, that he was very different in another way. He had a famous smile, and he appreciated a good joke. But it really turned him off if a joke was off color. Really turned him off. He felt that was an insult to the presidency, to the office that he held. And he never would laugh at one. And also, he didn't like any humor when it was a serious situation or a serious subject. I recall vividly, very early on, a briefing of the legislative leaders with regard to our civilian defense program. And all the numbers are put out about the number of missiles that might fall on the United States and all that sort of thing, and why we had to have a civilian defense program. And Senator Gene Milliken, who had a wry sense of humor from Colorado, after the briefing was concluded, he said, well, you know, after hearing this briefing, Mr. President, he said, I think what we all ought to do is to paint our asses white and run with the antelope. And Eisenhower, everybody else laughed, but not Eisenhower. He sort of smiled a bit, and he said, well, Gene, he said, let me say, we may not have time to paint our asses white if the bombs begin to fall and we aren't prepared for it.
After the convention, you went to Colorado for a fishing vacation with Eisenhower to plan the campaign, and this film of that event. Was that one of your favorite vacation memories?
No, I don't think it was one of mine, except for the dinner that Eisenhower cooked. He was a gourmet cook, and he wouldn't allow anybody else up there with him. There were about 10 of us that were up there at this camp in the mountains, and he cooked, I remember, a beef sirloin and potatoes. He let somebody else peel the potatoes. That was the only thing that he didn't do, but otherwise he did it all, and it was marvelous. But also he insisted that I learn to fish. I have never hunted or fished in my life. And so having to learn to fish and trout fishing, fly casting, that was really starting in the major leagues when I should have probably started with something much easier. And I remember he got me out there and showed me how to cast. I had tried it about 6 or 8 times, but when I brought the thing back and it caught him in his jacket once, he gave up on me. And I gave up. I've never tried it since.
You kicked off your campaign with a whistle-stop train tour up the coast of California, in California. And the first day out, you got zapped by a bolt from the blue. A headline in the New York Post newspaper said, Secret Nixon Fund. Secret rich men's trust fund keeps Nixon in style far beyond his salary. This was the first shot in what became known as the fund crisis. What was this secret rich man's fund?
Well, first, the headline was very misleading in 3 characteristics. The fund was not secret. It was not a rich man's fund. And the purpose of the fund was not to keep me in a style far above what I could afford. As a matter of fact, it was a routine fund, which were very common in the Congress then and even more so today, which took care of political expenses that could not be properly charged to the government. For example, and this is hard to think, if you were to tell a senator today from California that the government only paid for 1 round trip a year between Washington and California, he'd say, I really can't serve in the office. Today, I think it's 10 or 12 that they allow. But in any event, this fund of $18,000 had been set up after I won the Senate campaign so that I could conduct year-round campaigning and get back to California. It paid for some of my travel expenses. It paid for some of my mailings. It paid for some extra office help to handle a huge volume of mail that I received as a new senator from California. Absolutely nothing went for personal purposes. It was not secret. It was Mr. Dana Smith and my finance chairman in the 50 campaign sent over several thousand letters to supporters all over the state. And it was not a rich man's fund either. As far as that's concerned, there were some rich men that contributed to it, but the limit on the contributions was $500. The average contribution was $243. Nevertheless, all that being said, once the headline appeared, it really created a firestorm.
It later turned out that there was a Stevenson fund, that Governor Stevenson had a fund of his own. What were the differences between the Nixon fund and the Stevenson fund?
Well, It's interesting to how we learned about the Stevenson Fund. After I had gone on my campaign train up into Portland, and it was decided that I returned to Los Angeles to make a nationwide broadcast, the so-called Checkers speech, as it later came to be known. On the way down, as I was working my notes, Murray Chotiner, my campaign manager, slipped into the seat beside me and says, "I don't want to interrupt you," he said, "but you know, I kind of smell a rat here. Here, Stephen Mitchell, who was the Democratic National Chairman, has demanded that you get off the ticket. Several newspapers have. Several of the leading Democratic officials have. But Stevenson is not saying a word. I smell a rat." And sure enough, the next day, the rat exposed himself. What had happened, I don't mean Stevenson was the rat, but in any event, the next day, it became known that contractors doing business with the state had contributed to a Stevenson fund. Stevenson office immediately put out a story to the effect, well, this fund was different because it was solely for the purpose of supplementing the salaries of people on his staff who couldn't otherwise serve in state government if they didn't have this salary supplementation. And it indicated that the fund was $18,000 only. Well, the press, in one of the rare times when they did not have a double standard, asked Stevenson for a press conference so that he could explain his fund, just as I was going to explain mine on television. They petitioned him, as a matter of fact, and he just flat turned it down. It was only years later, long after Stevenson was dead, that his authorized biographer, John Barlow Martin, disclosed that the fund was much bigger and very different from the one that had been admitted in the campaign. It was for $84,000. The major contributors put up $5,000. They did so with the expectation, no promise, but expectation that they might get business from the state. It was not used solely for political purposes. It was used, for example, to pay for Stevenson's annual Christmas parties. It was used for the purpose of hiring an orchestra for a dance that his sons were having. And under the circumstances, therefore, the fact that it was being used for personal purposes as well as political purposes totally distinguishes it from my fund. Now, in retrospect, therefore, it seems that I have the best of the argument, but Stevenson had the media with him, and so it took a broadcast which went over the heads of the media, in fact, over the heads of the politicians, to win the day.
What was Eisenhower's reaction when he got word of the Post story? Because, of course, one of the things you were running on was, or running against, was the scandal-ridden corruption of the mess in Washington, the Democratic administration. How did he react?
Well, I wasn't there, but all that I knew, that I didn't hear anything from him. Sherman Adams called, Jim Haggerty called. I didn't take their calls. I wasn't going to be fobbed off on some aide. Even though I was just 39 years of age, I knew better than that. But I heard, for example, that Herbert Hoover had made a supportive statement. I had a nice wire from Warren Burger, who later became Chief Justice, a wire from Jerry Ford, who later became president, and a very warm statement made by Bob Taft when he said he didn't see what was wrong. He says, this is something that seems to be a regular pattern, and the only question is whether or not he was affected by his votes, and it appears that he was going to vote the way most of his supporters wanted him to vote anyway. He'd been elected by them. These were his supporters. But nothing from Eisenhower.
Were you surprised or hurt by Eisenhower's silence?
Not hurt to an extent, but then as I thought it through, not necessarily surprised or hurt, because I realized he was not a politician. And I realized, too, from what I later heard, that he was under terrific heat. There were some people on his staff who did not approve of my being on the ticket in the first instance. They preferred a more liberal candidate than I was. And also, Eisenhower was very sensitive about the media. He'd always had a very good press when he was in Europe, and he was very sensitive about it. And so consequently, when he learned that the press had taken a poll and by a margin of 40-2 said that Nixon should get off the ticket as Stephen Mitchell had demanded, and as the New York Herald Tribune, a Republican paper, as well as the Washington Post, a Democratic paper, had demanded. He then told the press in an off-the-record session that there was going to be no attempt here to whitewash Nixon, that he had to come out clean as a hound's tooth. He also made the point that he had confidence of my integrity. So that's all I heard. This was not from him directly. It's what I was reading in the papers. In other words, he was saying, in effect, though, I could read between the lines, not that I was innocent till I was proved guilty, but that I had to prove my innocence. In other words, there was the presumption of guilt. I had to prove that I was clean as a hound's tooth.
When did you finally hear from him, or did you finally hear from him? What did you decide to do?
Well, the way it worked was this. Murray Chotiner had suggested to me that I should use the money that was allocated for a vice presidential TV program to answer the charges. Tom Dewey called me, told me, he said, Eisenhower's advisors are a hanging jury as far as you're concerned. And he said, I think what you ought to do is to go on TV and ask the people to indicate whether they support you or not, which was exactly the way Murray had come down. So up to this time, I still hadn't heard from Eisenhower, and finally in Portland, I got a call from him. It was a very friendly call. He said, I understand it's rather difficult. And I said, yeah, it hasn't been easy. He then went on to say that he wanted me to make the decision as to whether or not I should stay on the ticket and so forth. He said, after all, you've got a lot of support in this country. He said, I don't want it to appear that I have knocked you off and condemned an innocent man. I then went on to say, well, I'd be willing to leave if it would serve his interests or the interests of the ticket. But he said, no, that was not the way it should be done, and I should make the decision. Well, the conversation went on for a while, and finally he came up with the same suggestion that Tom Dewey had made, except he elaborated on it. He said, not only answer the fund, but he said, tell the country everything you have ever received, how much money you have earned, what it's been used for, what your worth is, and so forth. He said, I advise that be done, which was shrewd advice. And I said, well, General, I'll be glad to do that, because I've got nothing to hide. I said, but once I've made the broadcast, he said, then can we make a decision? He said, no, he says, I think we should take 3 or 4 days to see how it goes. I said, well, General, I said, the problem here is the indecision. I said, we've really got to get it decided, because otherwise it's going to be ballooned bigger than it is, even is the present time. And then I sort of blew my top a bit, and I said, you know, there comes a time when you either have to shit or get off the pot. Well, for me, a 39-year-old senator, to say this to the Supreme Commander of Europe forces, a great war hero whom I admired enormously, a presidential nominee who was going to be president, was pretty shocking. He took it rather well, though, and his last words were, keep your chin up. So that was that.
So you decided to make a national television speech.
Yes.
You had to go back to Los Angeles to do it. And you've described the moments just as you were getting ready to go to the studio, you received a phone call from Mr. Chapman.
Yes, Mr. Chapman was Governor Dewey's code name. You know, even those days, I guess people were afraid that they were being tapped or what have you. And I wouldn't put it past some of our friends on the other side. But be that as it may, he called and said, this is Mr. Chapman. I knew it was Dewey. And I was scheduled to go out on the television to the studio in 30 minutes. And I was working on my notes. The speech, incidentally, was to be in 3 sections. I should lay the groundwork for that. First, I was going to explain the fund, as I've explained it earlier. Second, I was going to release all material with regard to everything I had earned and what I owned and what I didn't own and so forth, which of course virtually qualified me for food stamps, if we'd have had food stamps in those days, because I didn't have much. And third, I was going to go on the attack and take on Stevenson for his fund, and also point out why it was very important to have Eisenhower rather than Stevenson as president. I had it all worked out and had made the notes and so forth. So this call came in from Dewey, and Dewey said, Dick, he said, I don't agree with this, but I said, I think you should know that Eisenhower's advisors have all met. They unanimously agree that you should resign from the ticket. I said, well, I said, it's a little late to hear that. He said, I think probably that's what you should do. And he says, I think further that what you should do is resign from the Senate. And then what you should do is to announce you're going to resign from the Senate and then run for re-election so as you can be vindicated in re-election. It was getting a little unreal at that point because Dewey was a pro, he was a friend and so forth. So I just didn't say a word. Must have been about a 2-minute or at least 1 minute silence. And then Dewey said, well, what are you going to do? I said, Governor, I don't know what I'm going to do. Just tell your friends to listen to the broadcast. End of conversation. Well, that was a rather traumatic experience. And I went to the studio, and I must say, just before going in, after getting a little preparation for it, we were sitting in the control room, and Mrs. Nixon, Pat, was sitting with me, and I said, gee, I just don't think I can do this. She put her hand over and says, yes, you can. She's a very strong person. So we walked out to the set together, and I made the famous fun speech, or infamous, as my critics would say.
Two of the most famous images from that have to do with Mrs. Nixon's coat and a Cocker Spaniel puppy we have that gave the speech its name. We have two clips from the speech.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. We did get something to get after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, solid. And our little girl sister, the 6-year-old, named it Chuck. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. And now finally,
What made you think of those two images, the coat and the dog?
Well, I thought of them going back on the plane from Portland to Los Angeles because time was rushing down. I only had 2 days to prepare this speech of nationwide television, which of course was not being written by anyone else. I had written everything out on my own, as I always did at those times. And I couldn't sleep. I tried to doze off. It was a night flight. And I reached into the pocket in the airplane, which in those days, I don't know whether they still do it or not, you could get cards which you could mail to your friends from the airplane. And I got these cards out and I made notes. And it occurred to me that as far as the dog was concerned, I knew a little about political history. I remembered that FDR, whom I always admired as a great politician, had really decimated his opponents in one of his campaigns when in Boston he made a speech and he was answering some of the attacks and said these attacks were unfair against him. And then he went on to say, and I suppose next they're going to be attacking my dog, Fala. So I remembered Checkers, and that's why I said what I did about Checkers. Now the mink coat, of course, had to do with my old sparring mate, Harry Truman. In the Truman scandals period, one of the women, or girls, or should I say, working in the White House, a White House secretary, had received a $9,000 mink coat. Incidentally, today that'd only buy a muff, but then that was a pretty good mink coat. And so under the circumstances, that had been quite a scandal. And Truman, of course, had defended it. He always stood by his people. So I made the point, which was true, that Pat didn't have a mink coat, but she did have a respectable Republican cloth coat. Incidentally, one other thing that occurred to me on that, and I had to check it out with my old professor, Paul Smith. I remember Stephen Mitchell, the Democratic chairman, who could really use a knife pretty good and twist it, had said after my statement with regard to my fund, he says that in that usual arrogant way of the Eastern elite, he said if a man can't afford public life, he shouldn't go into it. Inference being that only people like Stevenson, who of course is a millionaire, should be allowed to run for office, at least high office. And I said, well, with regard to that, after all, as Lincoln said, God must have loved the common people because he made so many of them. Well, those three lines had dramatic impact because there were a lot of common people in the country. There were a lot of people in Texas, incidentally, that liked the fact that that dog came from Texas, and we carried Texas finally. And, of course, there were many people who resented what had happened about the cloth, about the mink coat. Later on, we got a lot of dog collars for Checkers as we campaigned around, and dog food enough to last 3 or 4 years. But nobody ever gave Pat a mink coat. I did buy one for her after we left the presidency.
As this next clip shows, the speech ended on sort of an unfinished note. You just faded out in mid-sentence.
And now finally, I know that you wonder whether or not I am going to stay on the Republican ticket or resign. Let me say this. I don't believe that I ought to quit because I'm not a quitter. And incidentally, Pat's not a quitter. After all, her name was Patricia Ryan, and she was born St. Patrick's Day, and you know the Irish never quit. But the decision, my friends, is not mine. I would do nothing that would harm the possibility of Dwight Eisenhower to become president of the United States. And for that reason, I am submitting to the Republican National Committee tonight through this television broadcast the decision which it is theirs to make. Let them decide whether my position on the ticket will help or hurt. And I'm going to ask you to help them decide. Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off. And whatever their decision is, I will abide by. But just let me say this last word. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to continue this fight. I'm going to campaign up and down in America until we drive the crooks and the communists and those that defend them out of Washington. And remember, folks, Eisenhower is a great man, believe me. He's a great man. And a vote for Eisenhower is a vote for what's good for America. Republican Senatorial Committee and the Republican Congressional Committee.
What happened there?
Well, I was cut off because I didn't give the address of the Republican National Committee, and consequently, I was really let down after the broadcast. I should point out that the reason that I was unable to do that and didn't finish quite on time was that I didn't see Ted Rogers, who was my television man, give the 1-minute signal. Also, although after that, I think after the broadcast, there were various anti-Nixon newspapers, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and others, who said the whole broadcast had been, speech had been written out in advance, had been practiced before television. I'd looked at tapes and so forth. Let me say, I have never seen a tape of myself. I had written every line of this myself. I had, as was my practice, I timed it in my mind, and I've always been able to know from just looking at what I have written and thinking it through without ever uttering it out loud about exactly how it'll come out. I could time it down to even the second. And in this instance, I missed the signal. And I consequently thought that the speech was a failure because I hadn't told them where to send their wires. As it was, incidentally, the wires went to the Republican National Committee. They went to Eisenhower and his train. They went to the hotel we were staying in, to my home in California, to my office in Washington, hundreds of thousands of them.
What was Eisenhower's reaction to the speech? What happened as a result of it?
Well, that was one of the problems that we almost blew the whole thing. I got back to the hotel. The wires were piled up, but no word from Eisenhower. Nothing. The first call that I took was from Darryl Zanuck, incidentally, the motion picture producer. I knew then that it had been a success because he was real pro. He said there's never been political television like that, there'll never be one like it again, and so forth. But in any event, what had happened, Eisenhower had sent a wire, but it had been lost because there were so many. And consequently, there was a period there when I hadn't heard from Eisenhower, and when some sort of a garbled media report of what he'd said, that one broadcast wasn't enough and that he was going to have to hear more, I blew my stack and told Murray Chotiner, I said, look, I'm going to resign from the ticket if that's the way they want to do it. I'm not going to make another broadcast. I'm not going to go through this anymore. Chotiner took my resignation and tore it up and so forth. But in any event, we finally did get Eisenhower's wire, which was a very gracious one, and I met him in Wheeling, Virginia, West Virginia, for the reunion.
How did Mrs. Nixon react to the speech?
You know, Mrs. Nixon, my mother, my father, what average people don't realize is that it is much harder on the families than it is on the man in the arena. The man in the arena can fight, as I was trying to fight in that broadcast. He can express himself, but the family just have to suffer in silence. But she was a very intelligent person. She was very strong. She's a fighter, I can assure you, and she wouldn't hear to any suggestion that I should resign. She said two things. She said, one, she said, if you resign, the Republicans are going to lose.